समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
आप समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Few visitors to Istanbul make it to Istinye, I'm guessing, despite the historic Rumeli Hisar fortress and the very beautiful Yanikoy promenade. Those who do might just drop in at the China restaurant, heir to the very first of its kind in the city, which was founded by the refugee Jelaluddin Wang Zhengshan in 1949 after a dramatic escape across Central Asia. The graveyard housing the restaurant's founder remains is just around the corner. For several years before friends lent Wang the money to start the restaurant, he struggled teaching Chinese to the first generation of Turkish students of the language. But the income barely covered rent. Hi, and welcome to this episode of The Print Explorer. To those of you who've been regular viewers, my special thanks. You'll be wondering, of course, why I've chosen to begin this episode around an obscure Chinese restaurant in Istanbul. Delicious as its offerings might be, I haven't had them. The thing is, Wang Zhengshan was a spy. Not one of those jump out of plane guys draped with fashion models, but the quiet, reflective kind who leave an abiding impact on the institutional thinking of the countries they work for. Towards the end of 1949, just before the People's Republic of China was formed, Wang migrated to Pakistan along with his family. A few contemporaries, mostly Kuomintang military figures, also arrived in the country. Their primary objective was to avoid persecution under the new communist regime. They crossed through Tibet into Jammu and Kashmir and then ended up going to Lahore before eventually heading south to Pakistan's then capital, Karachi. For 4 years from 1949, the superb intelligence blog maintained by Zaki Khalid informs us, Wang worked for Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Commonwealth Relations as a translator. From this role, though, he was soon moved on to become the liaison officer dealing with Pakistan's Intelligence Bureau, then led by Karim Raza, an imperial police officer from Uttar Pradesh. Wang interacted too with the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, the documents unearthed by Zaki Khalid show. The diaries maintained by Wang, now held in an archive in Singapore, tell us the discussions with the ISI had something to do with maps and cartography. The year is 1953, and that's very important for reasons we'll soon see. Look very carefully at this postage stamp, which is from my personal collection, a stamp issued by Pakistan in 1947. There's some things you'll probably find interesting, like Pakistan's claim to the Gujarati princedoms of Junagadh and Manavdar, which Pakistan said should be a part of its territory since they were ruled by Muslim kings. Then you'll have doubtless noticed the even bigger white space at the top of the map. Jammu and Kashmir, it states, international status not yet determined. Now, by the time this stamp was issued, there were Pakistani irregulars backed by Pakistan army officers trying to settle that issue in combat with the Indian army. But the staff, of course, at the postal printing press weren't to know that, and certainly not to know what happened. Anyway, the fascinating part of this story is that the map of Kashmir claimed by the Pakistanis spilled deep into Aksai Chin, the territory India also claimed, despite never really having exercised sovereignty there, and which India would eventually lose all hope of capturing after the War of 1962. From this, we can see that, like India, Pakistan wasn't quite sure where Kashmir ended and China began. The Indian government, we know, suffered from exactly the same doubt. The very first map of India, which you can see here, published in a document called the States Commission Report, has a vague yellow wash over Kashmir's borders with Ladakh. This shouldn't surprise us, of course. The monarchs of Kashmir and the rulers of Leh did not waste their time and money exercising border outposts in Aksai Chin. The region was crisscrossed by herdsmen and trade convoys who could be conveniently taxed when they reached a more hospitable town. For most of modern history, the border was simply irrelevant. It didn't matter where it was. I'm going to make a wild guess here, though, based on almost no archival evidence, and assert this. Among the things the ISI really wanted to know from Zaki Jelaluddin Wang was where China thought the border began and what bargain they could do around it. To make sense of this claim of mine, we'll need to take a little bypass again through history. The creation of Pakistan as the West saw it was part of a religiously inspired fortress in Asia meant to hold back the threat of Soviet communism. The Kuomintang or KMT, the West's partners in the Second World War, had disintegrated in the face of Mao Zedong's Revolutionary People's Liberation Army or PLA. Former Nazis from Central Asia were recruited in their dozens, the CIA's own documents tell us, in the hope of inciting insurrection in the Soviet Union's Muslim-majority republics. Leaders of Pakistan embraced this plan as they sought to give their new nation an identity and geopolitical meaning. Liaquat Ali Khan, Pakistan's first prime minister, gave the Egyptian Islamist leader Saeed Ramadan a radio show, the French scholar Caroline Forrest has recorded. Abdul Wahab Azam, an arch-reactionary who, by the way, was the grandfather of Al-Qaeda chief Ayman al-Zawahiri, served as Egypt's ambassador. Through Ramadan, Arab intellectuals also encountered the views of Abul Ala Maududi, the leader of the Jamaat-e-Islami and one of the ideologues who invented the idea of an Islamic state. For Maududi, it was imperative for Muslims, and I quote, to seize the authority of the state, for an evil system takes root and flourishes under the patronage of an evil government, and a pious cultural order can never be established until the authority of the government is wrested from the wicked. Islam itself, Maududi claimed, was, I quote again, a revolutionary ideology which seeks to alter the social order of the entire world and rebuild it. In one essay written much later, al-Zawahiri approvingly cited Maududi to argue that, I quote, democracy was a new religion based on making the people into gods and giving them God's attributes. This is tantamount to associating idols with God and falling into unbelief, al-Zawahiri asserted. So you had this long Islamist tradition, and Pakistan wanted to capitalize on it. The Chinese Hui Muslims fleeing the People's Republic likely thought in Pakistan that they were entering a sanctuary, not because of the Islamism, but simply because it was a Muslim country. Hui Islamists, not ordinary Hui Muslim believers, had actually begun showing up in British India in the mid-1930s, looking to create solidarities and alliances linking their territories with the still surviving caliphate in Turkey. Hai Weilang, who arrived in Kolkata in 1934 and went on to study at the Aligarh Muslim University, argued that ethnic Turkish Muslims could have an Islamic state not limited to Kashgar and its environments, but extending from the eastern borders of Afghanistan all the way to the Great Wall of China. Islamic nations ought to help the Hui, Hai argued, and I quote, cut off the Chinese heathen living there, be they be merchants or workers, and refuse Chinese consulates unless they are staffed by Chinese Muslims. Kuomintang leaders probably didn't appreciate this kind of language a huge bit, not being Hui Muslims, but they also made desperate appeals for Islamic help. Following the eruption of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, the KMT Muslim leader Ma Tianying successfully convinced the party to send a delegation to the Middle East. Little came of their 13-country tour though. The Middle East, the Ummah, wasn't interested in the problems of Central Asia. But there were other Islamists too who kept arriving from Central Asia into India. The Konkan-born preacher Muhammad Rustamov arrived at the famous Darul Uloom Seminary at Deoband around 1925, having earlier studied at religious institutions in Bukhara and then Ajmer. Likely, the work of the historian Michael Fredholm suggests, he was recruited by Deoband missionaries who had been visiting Central Asia from 1925. As late as 1951, declassified CIA documents show, Xinjiang politicians who fled in the face of the PLA were using Karachi as a rear base. In an interview to Arab News, former Xinjiang Minister of the Interior Haji Jelaluddin Zhengshan warned the new communist leaders were working to crush Islam and called for support for insurgents like Usman Bator. Little imagination is needed to see that the recruitment of Wang took things one step further for Pakistan's intelligence services. Wang wasn't a random refugee. He was a middle-level bureaucrat in the KMT with experience of how the world ran and what decisions could be made geopolitically. The most important thing Wang might have told the ISI was likely this: that great big white wash on Kashmir, he would have said, had in fact been drawn up by the KMT and simply inherited by the People's Republic of China. To build a road to control Xinjiang, the PLA had no option but to assert its claim over Aksai Chin, because that was the only route that connected Tibet onto Xinjiang. Likely, the Pakistan army took note that there might be some kind of trade to be had with the Chinese over Aksai Chin and filed it away in its institutional memory. I should emphasize again, I'm speculating, but almost certainly the knowledge Wang brought to the ISI would also have been invaluable to the CIA. This was, after all, the high noon of Pakistani-US cooperation. Pakistani Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan, Commander-in-Chief General Ayub Khan, Foreign Minister Zafrullah Khan, Foreign Secretary Ikramullah, Finance Minister Ghulam Muhammad, Defense Secretary Major General Iskandar Mirza, and Special Envoy Mir Laik Ali, they were all traveling to the United States during this period as privileged guests of this country, as part of that anti-communist project I spoke of. For all their pro-Islamist talk though, Pakistan remained very careful not to irk the Chinese. India proved less cautious. In 1951, the Kazakh anti-communist rebels Yulbars Khan and his followers reached Lhasa in January 1951, as I said, after a remarkable crossing of the Tibetan plateau during midwinter. Lhasa detained most of the followers, but Yulbars and 5 of his companions were permitted to proceed to Darjeeling in India. Yulbars then travelled overland to Kolkata before flying to Taiwan, where he arrived back on the 1st of May 1951 to take up a comfortable sinecure under the KMT as governor of Xinjiang in exile. I'm guessing the Chinese were not very happy with that Indian diplomatic action. Having reconstituted a semblance of nomadic life along the verdant Kashmiri plains from late 1952 to mid-1954, all 350 surviving Kazakhs who came with Yulbars eventually agreed to relocate to settlements in rural Anatolia in Turkey. Again, the People's Republic of China was less than pleased by these Indian actions. From 1962, as tensions between India and China spiked into war, Pakistan moved to cash in on its goodwill. It offered border negotiations on Aksai Chin based on recognition of the ground situation, customary practice, and mutual agreement. In essence, Pakistan accepted that it had no stakes in Aksai Chin, the great swathe you'll remember that it had marked across its postage stamp. India proved a more difficult negotiator, refusing to cede Aksai Chin and pushing patrols forward to assert its claims elsewhere in the Himalaya. Now, there was a reason for this. This wasn't just bloody-mindedness. India had to insist that all the territories of British India were legitimately its. It couldn't, after all, claim Kashmir otherwise. In 1963, though, Pakistan would sign an agreement with China on the Karakoram Pass, sabotaging all hope of a peaceful resolution on Kashmir and heading up to the 1965 war. There are many Indian scholars who believe India could have made a similar agreement on Aksai Chin in the 1950s, recognizing China's strategic need for a road to Xinjiang in return for China conceding India's claims in the northeast, especially Arunachal Pradesh. This is a vigorous argument, and it's a story we'll return to, I'm sure, sometime. So, what's the lesson from all this? For one, it demonstrates an admirable flexibility among the Pakistani intelligence services. I cannot imagine their Indian equivalents, the Indian Police Service led Intelligence Bureau, hiring a foreign national in 1954, let alone giving him access to sensitive materials and involving him in making national security assessments. The benefits to the ISI and the Pakistan IB were, of course, significant. There was very little knowledge of China's border regions within either country, Pakistan or India. By hiring Wang, they gained significant learnings on communist and anti-communist activity along the lands to their east and succeeded in building linkages between Islamists from across the world. True, this was not a strategic triumph. The Islamists Pakistan cultivated would come to be as much a source of strategic destruction as strategic strength, and Pakistan's army continues to pay for those decisions with blood to this day. Yet, Pakistan avoided ending up with the same kind of pointless border conflict that India remains burdened with China to this day. And it definitely benefited from its deep knowledge that Wang brought to its intelligence services. To talk through complex issues among yourself is useful. To listen to someone who brings fresh perspective and insight is even more so. The lesson then is the most basic one that spies and diplomatic establishments should learn. Invite disruptive thinkers into your echo chambers, even if you don't agree with what they have to say. Following his years in Pakistan, Wang chose to move his family to Turkey, where his children integrated and flourished. His full role as an advisor to the Pakistan IB and ISI might never be revealed unless those institutions' archives are someday declassified. To the best of anyone's knowledge, he never got a medal, but he probably played as instrumental a role as any in the making of China's policies on China's Muslim West. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm a contributing editor at ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of The Print Explorer.